Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us to celebrate Women's History Month with an insightful discussion about women breaking the glass ceiling, perspectives across professions. Tonight, we'll discuss women's quest for gender parity and reflect upon the glass ceiling in a meaningful and compelling way. And we'll have a unique opportunity to hear from Princeton alumni from different professions: foundation government leader, pianist, architect, marketing branding advisor, business transformation HR expert, and producer talent agent, who will share their stories and their perspectives on topics like gender bias, glass ceilings, mentorship, and leaning in. So to help me share the story and insights about gender equality, I'm delighted to have 5 Princeton alumni and classmates to join me. Beth Cobert, a leader in government foundations and board member of CBRE. Ellen Dunham Jones, a renowned architect. Donna Wang Friedman, a concert pianist. Susanna Malat, a business transformation and HR expert. And Tina Treadwell, a producer and talent agent. As we confront the pandemic and rebuild our economy, gender inequality is not only a pressing moral and social issue, it's also a critical global economic challenge. If women, who account for half the world's working age population, don't achieve their full economic potential, the global economy will suffer. Studies have shown that supporting women in the workplace can result in exponential growth to companies' bottom lines and also speed our global economic recovery. In fact, the consulting firm McKinsey, which Beth will share with you later that she worked for, estimates that increased gender equality could result in 13 trillion of incremental GDP by 2030. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to thank the Princeton Club of New York, who's sponsoring tonight's program, as well as our many co-sponsors, including the Princeton Association of New York City, Princeton Arts Alumni, Princeton Club of Georgia, Princeton Club of Southern California, and Princeton in Hollywood. Tonight, in keeping with our subject, we're going to take a creative approach to sharing our bios. You've already read our traditional bios. Now we're going to share our backgrounds with a focus on the glass ceiling. And instead of me introducing everyone, we'll introduce each other. So let's start with Donna Wang Friedman, introducing Ellen Dunham Jones, and then Ellen will intro Donna. So Donna, take it away.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Okay, so Ellen. After undergrad and grad degrees in architecture at Princeton, Ellen worked for several New York firms where she was not sent on construction sites because she was a girl. She was the first woman architect up for tenure at UVA and the first denied. Her research increasingly focused on sustainable retrofits of dead malls, aging office parks, etc. She was hired at MIT, but told that if she was a real urbanist, like the male professors, she should focus on downtowns. Suburbia's feminized status wasn't worth study. 2 award-winning books later, a viral TEDx that turned TED Talk, and plenty of top media attention, she has been recognized as one of the 100 most influential urbanists ever. And as Architecture Records 2018-2019 Woman Educator of the Year.
Thank you, Donna. It is really hard to follow that, but what helps is that I get to introduce you now. So already a concertizing pianist before arriving on campus, Donna went to Princeton to broaden her horizons and explore new interests. After graduation, she got a job at International Creative Management, where she was the only female assistant agent in the rock and roll division. I was so jealous. But after 8 months of getting her boss coffee, answering phones, and covering club gigs until 3 a.m. before she'd crash at my place, Donna ran back to Juilliard and for her master's degree, won competitions, toured Europe, China, South America, and the US, got married, had kids, stopped touring, and reinvented herself. She is the co-creator and co-host of Her Music, Her Story, a mini-series on WQXR that spotlights the lives and music of female composers. She is also the creator of Heritage and Harmony in collaboration with WQXR, a series that shines a light on the stories and music of leading Asian classical musicians. She is proud to be the curator of the Donna Wang Friedman 80 Masterclass series at Princeton and a member of the music department's advisory council.
And we have a surprise for you tonight because we actually have 2 performances that will be showing by Donna. So by the end of watching them, you'll be very happy that she left ICM to start a performing career. And now I'm delighted to introduce Beth Kober. After completing her degree in economics at Princeton, where she was one of less than a handful of women in any quantitative class, and an MBA at Stanford Business School, Beth joined McKinsey & Company, where the number of women in the room only occasionally exceeded the number of women in her economic classes at Princeton. Beth set new precedents there by working part-time so she could better balance the demands of family and career. And she was one of the first 2 individuals elected as senior partner while on a part-time program, leading to policy changes around career flexibility that are now embedded at McKinsey. That is an incredible impact there. Beth left McKinsey for senior roles in the Obama administration, where she worked to lead efforts to make government work better to serve the American people. Beth now leads the Markle Foundation's Rework America Alliance, a national collaboration to drive a more inclusive recovery from the dislocations of the pandemic, which, as we all know, has disproportionately affected women, people of color, and those with less formal education.
Thanks, Wendy. And now my turn to return the favor. Wendy Gerber first broke the glass ceiling at 14 years old when she and her twin sister became the first newsgirls in New York State for Newsday. I think we all remember those haircuts and those shirts. It was showcased, as shown here, in Newsday's offices as one of the key moments in the decade of the 1970s. After studying public and international affairs at Princeton and graduating from NYU Law, Wendy worked as an international corporate lawyer in New York and Paris. She decided to move to the business side and join Ralph Lauren as the head of marketing and communications. After helping build a global marketing department, increase revenues by 80%, and launch Ralph Lauren's foundation and corporate responsibility programs, Wendy left her Ralph Lauren pumps behind for flats and straddled the worlds of consulting and raising children. Wendy continues to consult for Fortune 500 companies and global nonprofits, driving strategic growth and marketing, while also working with corporate leaders to lead on sustainability and social impact.
Thank you very much, Beth. And now Tina Treadwell will introduce Susanna Malat, and then Susanna will introduce Tina.
Hi, everyone. Really happy to introduce a very esteemed woman who I respect very much. Susanna Malat broke her first glass ceiling at age 5 when she was the sole female playing Army with her neighborhood pals Joey, Chucky, and Kevin growing up in Milwaukee. 4 decades later, Susanna was the sole female co-founder of Axiom Consulting Partners, a growth advisory and business transformation consultancy based in Chicago, where she is currently a partner and leads implementation of the firm's diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy.
Thanks so much, Tina. Thank you. And how humbling it is to be with this group of amazing classmates tonight. I have the pleasure of introducing to you Tina Treadwell, who was born to two groundbreaking music entrepreneurs whom she credits with fostering within her a never say die attitude. Tina has endeavored to live her life by trying to exceed expectations and to never accept the first no she is offered. As an independent casting director, a network TV executive at Disney, to her present position as CEO of the talent management development firm Treadwell Entertainment Group, Tina endeavors to bring that same ceiling-shattering attitude to managing her clients' acting and music careers, as well as to producing film, TV, and theatrical projects on their behalf. Back to you, Cindy.
Thank you all. And as you can see, it's such a delight to be with such an amazing group of classmates, Princeton women, and just women in general. So I think this gives you all some helpful background for our discussion. And just to set the stage, our program tonight is going to last about an hour and 15 minutes. We'll all be chatting for about an hour, and then we'll answer questions from you, the audience, for 15 to 20 minutes. So please remember to click on the Q&A tab and to type your questions into the box, and we promise to get to as many as we can. So let's start the discussion by taking a look at how our diverse paths, but common historical trajectories since we were at Princeton, represents and reflects similar lessons that we've learned. So many people talk about how mentors have played a pivotal role in their careers. Let's talk a bit about whether we had female mentors or role models in our careers and whether that mattered. So I'll kick it off. I didn't have a mentor in my career, although I've had a number of women and men who provided guidance along the way. In fact, in terms of mentoring, sometimes I've found that women can be more competitive instead of helping another woman move forward. Tina, how about you?
Well, I would say that, the entertainment industry is sort of one of the last bastions of true apprenticeship. Just like Donna's experience, you work for an assistant and you learn everything about their business by being on their calls. I had an interest after being in Triangle Club and loving the arts. I started directing Equity Waiver Theater, and one of my theater mates said, you should go into casting. And casting has been traditionally a female-driven area of the entertainment business. And many commercial casting directors opened their doors to me and allowed me to work for them, ghost for them. And eventually through that, I met my first business partner and started a commercial casting company. So the casting women in my life definitely did give me the opportunity to grow and learn and then be able to grow to become a full-fledged casting director. However, when I would meet with women executives, oftentimes they were the ones that you could sometimes feel as if they were a little competitive. And ironically, were the men executives and people in power that truly took it decision and made a decision to elevate me in giving me my first job in a TV writing room, or Rich Ross giving me a job to oversee the casting at Disney Channel. Or Keaton Wayman is giving me the chance to, cast the second season of Living Color after having been, given the opportunity by another casting director, Shamin Bernard. So it's kind of one of those catch-22s where, I feel for me, the women in my life that were introduced by my entrepreneurial parents were the examples that helped me know, when you see something that you can aspire to be something.
Thanks, Tina. So Susanna, Donna, and Beth, what about you? Did you have a female or a male mentor? Susanna, let's start with you.
I had probably one of the best mentoring relationships in my career, rather late in my experience. And part of what made it so powerful was the fact that this mentor was a true ally. And for anyone who's not familiar with the concept of allyship, please take a look at Professor Kenji Yoshino's model out of the Center for Diversity and Inclusion at NYU. It so happened that this male mentor I had was a member of the board of one of our clients, voted against hiring our firm, was overruled by the other directors. And then it turned out that Jim Haw, in the Princeton class of 58, out of that experience became a mentor to this day. He's an ex-KPMG, a retired KPMG partner, has had his own family consulting business. And I still rely on him to this moment for advice as a sounding board, just to, as a reality checker, because it's so easy to get in our own echo chambers of insecurity and doubt, even after a long and successful career. The relationship with Jim as an ally, as a mentor, is probably the best example. And Jim, if you're listening tonight, I thank you.
Thanks very much, Susanna. Donna, how about you in the music world?
Well, when I went back to Juilliard for my master's, I had the privilege of studying with the late, great Adele Marcus. Back in her day, she was the star maker for classical pianists, but she was infamous for being very difficult as a teacher, and particularly nasty towards the few female students that she accepted into her class. In her own right, she was actually an incredible pianist. I would say she was one of the greatest pianists I'd ever heard, but her own career as a concertizing pianist was cut short due to really bad stage fright. In fact, one of the famous stories about her is that she vomited on the keys during one of her performances. So anyway, my first lesson with her was kind of eye-opening. I brought in a set of pieces, piano pieces by Johannes Brahms, very difficult pieces. And in hindsight, a very foolish choice for a first lesson with this grande dame. And as I started playing, she started making these groaning and grunting sounds. And they would get louder and louder as I kept playing, until finally she screamed, "Stop." And I was shaking, and she took my music, she threw it on the floor, she spat on it and said, "This is what I think of your Brahms." And I think she waited for me to cry, and I wanted to, but for whatever reason, I was able to say very calmly, "Miss Marcus, I know I have a lot to learn, and I was hoping that I could learn from you. But if you can't teach me in a respectful manner, I think I'm going to have to switch teachers." Now, I had just won the highly coveted Gino Bachauer International Piano Competition at Juilliard. So every single teacher on that faculty wanted me in their studio. So it didn't take long for her to say, "Oh, Donna, dear, no, of course we're going to work wonderfully together." And from that day on, we did for many years. So, you know, it was an interesting, eye-opening experience for me.
It was also incredible that you were able to maintain your composure,
Oh, that's the
react
Princeton.
in such a pragmatic way.
I have to say that's the Princeton education, because I've only collaborated and worked with the kindest, most generous professors at Princeton. And, you know, with my thesis and my JP, I was taught how to collaborate. You know, they respected me and I respected them. And so I think that really was the Princeton education kicking in right there when I needed it.
That's great. Thank you. Beth, how about for you, your mentors?
My mentors were mostly male, one female, but mostly male. And I think, and frankly, all very different from me in so many ways, not just male and female, but style. But I think even more than mentorship, what was really important was that they were sponsors, another good term to look up. And what I mean by that, they weren't just giving me advice and supporting me, but they were creating opportunities by putting me in situations that I probably didn't have the confidence to put myself in. whether it was sending me off to meet with CEOs on my own or putting me in leadership roles. It was really that proactive, taking a stand and helping me succeed that was really important beyond the words of guidance and advice. And I think looking for that, someone who's going to put you out there and help you create opportunities is incredibly important.
That's terrific. And it is really important. And just listening to everything we've said, some of us have had female mentors, some male. So as we go forward in terms of achieving better gender parity, to really drive change, it's so important for women to lay the groundwork for other women's success by paying it forward. And a lot has been written about women trying to juggle raising a family and building careers. I know I went through this, a number of us did, and especially during the pandemic, women are far more susceptible to burnout. The United Nations found that in addition to paid employment, women absorb 75% of the world's invisible work, which includes cooking, cleaning, homeschooling, caring for children. So it would be great to have a bit of a chat about juggling the double shift, both career and traditional women's caregiving, and how that impacted each of our careers. I'll start by saying that, as Beth mentioned, I stepped off the fast track before having my second child and went from a very high-powered job with Ralph Lauren into consulting. So I'd have the flexibility to really juggle raising a family and building a career. At the same time, at that point in time, working part-time wasn't an option. And then later, when I worked for Citigroup, traveling 3 days a week from New York City to Wilmington, Delaware, I'd take care of my mother every other night while continuing to work long hours during the day. So it was really, really tiring and exhausting, but it was so important. And fortunately, my children were grown at that point. So I wasn't part of the sandwich generation that had to care for both parents and young children at the same time. Did anybody else step off the fast track for a while? Beth?
So I worked part-time, or the McKinsey equivalent of part-time, for 11 years. And when I first started, there was this whole period when you get your bonus and you literally have to have your own Excel spreadsheet because the payroll systems didn't know what to do with you. So you had to make sure you actually got paid correctly. But I did that for about 11 years. And then actually I flip-flopped with my husband, who took some time off from his investment banking career. It was in the middle of the tech bust. So there was frankly nothing for him to do at work anyway, as he would describe. And we flip-flopped. And, it was a different way of doing things that worked out well for our family, but required both of us to make some adjustments along the way.
Thank you. Susanna, how about for you?
I had a similar experience about 3 years into my consulting career at a firm called Simpson & Company. I decided the superwoman notion was bunk and asked for a short sabbatical so I could figure out what I was really going to be doing in that industry and could I hack it, because I wanted to be the best mother of all time as well as the best professional of all time. And at that moment, Simpson, I think I was the first professional to have had a child in Simpson & Company, asked for some time off, and then came back and said, I think I'd really like to work part-time. And I kept waiting for one of the partners or principals to say no. We have policies that won't allow that. And everybody kind of just said, okay, tell us what you need. And so that was the beginning of one stint of part-time. I changed to a different firm, actually job shared with another consultant in that new firm, so that the two of us, one would work Monday, Wednesday. We were flying back and forth to California. And then we overlapped on site with the client on Wednesday. And then the other one would stay Wednesday through Friday. That was a great experience, actually. And then went into continuing part-time work after that as we started Axiom in 2005. I decided to go back to full-time, but use a flexible schedule because my youngest was in kindergarten and I wanted to be at home when she got home from school those first few years. So this is the well-kept secret about consulting. While it's a really, really tough business, it's also one of the most flexible in terms of crafting your own schedule and career needs. I mean, Beth has spoken to some of this. I certainly had that experience, and Wendy, your own experience kind of is testimony to that as well.
Okay, thank you. Tina, I know you wanted to speak to this as well.
Well, you know, it's ironic because both of my parents were entrepreneurs. My father had managed, you know, Billie Holiday, Sarah Vaughan, and my mother took over the Drifter after my father died. And when I'd expressed to her that I wanted to work inside a corporation, she said, "You work for someone else? Like, we don't do that." And I'm saying, no, truly, I do want to go inside somewhere, learn how series and movies and specials are made so I can become a content provider. And so I asked her if she would support me for 6 months while I produced a play about the life of Dinah Washington that ended up going off Broadway, that I would get a job by the end of that year. So truth happened. People found out about me. I got recommended to Rich Ross, who was coming with a team, Geraldine Laybourne, Ann Sweeney, coming from Nick, who were the architects of Nick coming to Disney Channel to revamp it. And I got hired by Rich, and he basically told me, "I'm going to look like a brilliant person, or, you know, you're going to be a blip on the radar. You know, you're African American, you're Princeton grad, you're an entrepreneur, you know, young talent. And so if you succeed, I'm brilliant. If you fail, you'll be a bleep on the radar." And, you know, and that was it. So I have this great career at Disney Channel. I'm helping to launch amazing talent. 5 years in, I get a phone call that my mother's ill. And now, so she's the one who helped me truly get to this position. And that's when I realized that I needed to leave. And my boss said, "You have about 2 years to be able to leave this industry until you become irrelevant." And I said, there's no option. I mean, in my career, I am going to help take care of my mother. So ironically, they gave out severance packages at this one moment in time in Disney. And I went to Europe, I brought my mom home, and then I had to create a home-based business so that I could be on call. So I had to leave corporate America. And management, which was ironically the family business, although they were in the music industry, I started touring the country, talking to kids and their parents about the business, and found that I could utilize all of the amazing people and the Rolodex of people that I knew to help young people aspire and to, to create an opportunity that they could manifest their dreams. But it's been, it was a difficult thing. There are people, the woman who took over for me after I left Disney is still at Disney Channel. She's 25 years in. She's, the pension, the whole thing. I got vested by accident because I left 3 months shy of being vested. And though Andy Davis, who is the director who did The Fugitive, and he was doing a movie called The Guardian, and Shia LaBeouf, who's one of the talents that we helped mentor at Disney Channel, said he was doing a movie. He invited me to come and work on that film with him. And then when my mother took really ill, he supported me to go back home. And I said, okay, I need to stay put. And so, it's hard to see that change, but just as, Susan and Beth were saying, the flexibility that I have as being a business owner, having my own company, having elevated one of the parents with whom I'd worked, whose son I had managed and who's now my business partner, Kim Coleman. And, it's really been great to support another woman to be able to be successful. And we're both, groundbreaking and helping young people and have stars on television and movies. And you see that path that you could have had you not taken that break or not been forced to leave something that you loved. But I feel that what God showed me in terms of taking that responsibility out of love and having a better relationship with my mother and helping her through when she passed away, I would never have I would never have made a different decision.
Thank you for that, Tina. And the idea of trying to find balance is always a challenge for women, particularly. I learned that you really can't have it all. Life requires compromises that are made along the way. And I think that's been a large part of the learning process for me and probably for many of us. So as we talk about gender, it's perceived so differently now. There's much more fluidity. And judging by my children and their relationships, there's also a lot more parity among roles. Relationships are more of a partnership. Ellen and Tina, what did you experience about gender roles during your career? Let's start with Ellen.
I certainly, I mean, I think in the world of architecture, the heroes are men. The awards, at one point, really famous, one of Princeton's grads, Bob Venturi, and his wife, Denise Scott Brown, won the biggest prize in architecture. Well, he won alone. They had been partners for 30 years. But he was the one who was given the prize. And I was there when she was being given a separate, much smaller prize, and asked, why did she feel about this? And she said, we're in a profession where the critics prefer crowning kings than queens. And it's sadly very much, I think, still true. If it's not the king-queen relationship, it's the wife role, the perception of women as wives. When I was denied tenure at my first teaching job, the committee was all male. Most of them were married to younger former students. So they perceived a woman architect as a wife, a helper in a subordinate role. And the way that I was doing projects with a colleague who was also up for tenure. He was my business partner. He was male. And the interviews that we each had, we compared notes afterwards. They grilled me on who drew this line? What was your role? Who did what? Did you design this piece, that piece, this, And I kept saying, no, we did all this together. I explained things very rationally. And then afterwards I asked Jude, wow, did they grill you about, did you draw this line? Did you design that piece? He said, no, we kind of talked about sports. I mean, it was just so different. And today, there are now a lot of the architecture schools, especially the Ivies, have women deans, including Princeton. But there's also, and there are a lot of husband-wife firms throughout the field, and yet it is still, the perception is always that the male is the designer and the woman is the helper who just kind of helps make things go along right. It saddens me how just prevalent that attitude still is.
Thanks, Ellen, for your candor and sharing that. I think it's true. There are still a lot of stereotypes that still apply across professions and other industries where there's really been a dedicated effort to elevating women's roles. Entertainment is one of those industries. We've seen over the last few years women starting to break through the glass ceiling as directors, etc. Tina, can you shed some light on that for us?
Well, I think that, again, in entertainment, again, there have always been certain categories that women have excelled and been allowed to excel in. I mean, there are amazing women who are costume designers and have won, Academy Awards and, and they're, like I had mentioned in casting. I think that over the 30 years that I've been in this business, I mean, as I mentioned, mentors like Anne Sweeney, who became the chairman of Buena Vista, Picture ABC Studios, Deborah Martin Chase, who's a producer, Suzanne DePass, Nina Shaw, who's a very amazing entertainment attorney. I mean, there are lots of examples like that. And women have, as you mentioned, are now, key executives running major companies, the head of departments, whether it be PR or development. And you see that in Netflix and all of the large companies. I think that the one area that has been challenging has been in the field of directing. I think that that's still that one helm of the ship, the bastion of being a part of leading, and it's still kind of being a difficult thing for the powers that be to support a woman in doing that. And yet there have been trailblazers who have done so and have done quite well. And I think it really does, you know, the business is a part of one of those entities where people like to work with people they know. And I think that that crosses many, you know, businesses in productions. You know, like a director will produce, you know, have the teams, and you know, you'll have writing rooms that the executive producer, you know, they've grown up with other writers. So if they didn't grow up with you, then you know it becomes difficult. And then it becomes more difficult when you're writing about things that aren't a part of your culture. And I do think that people are like making a, you know, an effort to do so. Chuck Lorre has a series on CBS that's called Bob and Abishola, and it's about a Caucasian man who falls in love with a Nigerian woman. And he made an effort to find a Nigerian comedian who then became part of the writing staff, who was like kind of a co-creator with him. And, you know, I think that people are trying to find that sense of authenticity and to be able to have those voices, because there were, you know, so many times where there was a group of, you know, Caucasian men who were writing stories about everyone. And, you know, this sense that you have to have legitimacy and authenticity in those scripts so that it really touches a chord in people's lives. And so I think now it is that point where you have African-American writers and directors who are producing movies. There was a day where they thought that a movie with African-Americans couldn't, you know, sell in, you know, internationally. And then you have something like Black Panther that sells billions of, you know, tickets around the world. And then you realize it really is about the storytelling. And, you know, and you have to give Disney a lot of credit for being a part of that as well. But I think that, you know, obviously there's still ways in which there needs to be progress in every of those areas. But, you know, I do feel within entertainment, there is an effort to do so. And because the dollar is driven by so many different cultures, they're really making an effort to have inclusion both in front of and behind the camera.
Thank you. And there's been a lot of progress, it seems, in the entertainment industry. I actually have an upcoming talk with Cecilia Peck, daughter of Gregory Peck, who's another one of our talented classmates. That's coming up on April 7th, and she'll be speaking about her hit star series called Seduced Inside the NXIVM Cult. So we're trying to promote women in these fields, really trying to break the glass ceiling and being very successful at doing so. We touched on gender bias, and I'd like to go back into that a little bit. I'm curious if you encountered gender bias at different stages in your career, and if so, how did you react to it? What, if anything, did you do about it? And looking back with 2020 hindsight, what would you have done perhaps differently? Ellen, let's start with you.
So for me, my first pretty powerful slap of cold water in the face was sophomore year at Princeton. An older professor, quite near retirement, just blatantly screwed me on a grade. Told me, I will never give anyone like you a grade higher than a B. I never have, I never will. And in a previous lecture class, he had said, women belong in the kitchen, not in architecture. Ha, ha, ha. My reaction to it, you know, I was annoyed, but my reaction was, you know, Princeton was 7-to-1 male to female when we started in 1976. It was 4-to-1 when we graduated in 1980, or close to 4-to-1. And so there was this feeling that every year we were at Princeton, there were more and more women entering all these male-dominated fields. So I just looked at this professor, grouchy, grumpy guy, and just wrote him off as he's a dinosaur. I'm the future. And that same attitude carried me through a number of other kind of disappointments throughout my career. But now that I'm not the future anymore, now I'm really mad that things haven't changed more. I think it's not so much that I would have done anything differently in hindsight. I don't think that, but I really do everything I possibly can now to make sure that I'm empowering both the women students, but also empowering the male students I want to be a role model to my male students just as much as to my female students.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Ellen. Donna, how about you?
Well, I've been performing professionally since I was 12 years old. And since then, I've received many reviews by music critics. And music critics are predominantly men. I think in my entire life, I've only received one review by a woman music critic. So even the really good reviews that I received were tainted with gender bias. And one that I remember that upset me a lot said her playing was such that if I were to close my eyes, I could only imagine a man 3 times bigger than she was on that stage. And I was thinking, if he wanted to say that I was a powerful pianist, why couldn't he just say that? Uh, you know, that just really didn't sit well with me. But the truth is, critiques like that never helped me, and they never really hurt my career. But unfortunately, gender bias played a huge role in destroying many careers of women composers throughout history. So, in fact, probably many of you have never heard of Cécile Chaminade before. Cécile Chaminade was one of the most famous and loved composers, male or female, in the late 1800s. President Teddy Roosevelt invited her to perform at the White House, and over 200 Chaminade clubs were created in this country alone for the sole purpose of playing her music. But after her Carnegie Hall concert in 1908, she received a scathing review from a male critic. And in it, he wrote, "This concert confirms what many of us already believe to be true, that although women may someday vote, they will never be able to compose any music that's worthwhile." And after that, there was a slew of negative press that turned her entire career around. And she ended up dying alone and her music completely forgotten. So when I hear things like that, I feel like in my own way, I want to do something. Which is why I created my series, Her Music, Her Story, to shine a light on the overlooked stories and music of women composers. And I'd love to share with you a very short snippet of one of Cécile Chaminade's pieces called Les Sylvains, the Fauns. And this is from my series, Her Music, Her Story, live at Steinway Hall in the good old days when we had live concerts.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Donna. That was really, really beautiful. And now you can all see why we're so happy that Donna left ICM to really be able to show her true talent on the stage. So we've all been very influenced by many things in our lives, including our parents who lay the early groundwork for us as individuals. I know on my part, my parents encouraged us to reach as high as we could. There were no differences between the opportunities they encouraged my sister and I to pursue, and nothing different than what they encouraged my brother to pursue. And when I decided to go into business instead of continuing to practice law, even after the expense of law school, they were okay with that. They fully supported my pursuing my dreams wherever that might lead. And I think that's an important part in empowering men and women to really go forth and try to achieve their dreams. What about for you, Donna?
Well, both of my parents were born and raised in China. My mother came from a very wealthy family in Shanghai, and my father came from a very poor family in Ningpo. But as it turns out, separately, they both fled their homeland in the 1940s uh, during the Japanese occupation. And they came to this country with nothing but their hopes and dreams. And together they worked really hard to give me a life filled with opportunity. And I like to say that if they were alive today, I think, like many of us, they would be devastated by the ongoing hate crimes against our Asian American community. And I also know that if they were with me last spring, when I was assaulted for being Asian, they would have been heartbroken. The truth is, all they ever wanted from me was to have a smooth sailing, stable, secure, safe life, and be happy. But they really didn't think that a career in music, especially for an Asian young woman, could ever give that to me. So for many years, we kind of butted heads. They mailed me many applications to business school. All their friends' kids were going to law school and business school. And they even suggested, oh, you'd be a very good real estate salesperson. And I had no idea why they would think that. But it really wasn't until they saw how dedicated I was and how much music meant to me and that I couldn't live without it. And that's when they turned around and they became my staunchest supporters and my biggest cheerleaders.
Thank you. So we've only got about 15 minutes left to talk. So what I'm going to do is start directing questions just to one individual for each of the questions so we can cover more ground. And I'm curious, is there a difference, do you think, in opportunities depending on your profession? For me, being in fashion and advertising over the course of my career, there's been a high percentage of women. But Beth, what was it like for you at the White House as acting director of the U.S. Office of Personnel Management and deputy director of the U.S. Office of Management and the Budget versus McKinsey, and now leading a foundation?
So of those experiences, McKinsey by far was the one that had the fewest representation of females, particularly as you got to senior levels in the firm. There were a small number of us, and we frankly became a very tight-knit band, trying to both advance each other's careers and advance our influence. When I got to the White House, it was a very different environment. In the Obama administration, there were a tremendous number of amazing women leaders, whether it was Sylvia Burwell, who was the director of the Office of Management and Budget and then went on to lead Health and Human Services as the cabinet secretary, Penny Pritzker, the Secretary of Commerce, Cecilia Munoz, who led the Domestic Policy Council, Susan Rice, and Lisa Monaco, who led the National Security Council. Those were the people at the senior levels in the room. If you're going to go with the Alexander Hamilton line, right? They were in the room. And so it was very much an environment where women had a voice, had a place to roll, and they were there because they had the talent to be leading those organizations. So that felt, frankly, it was way different than most of my McKinsey experience. Remember, I was largely serving financial services clients, and so there just aren't that many women at senior echelons in financial services. The nonprofit sector has actually a lot of women in different roles. Depends upon which sectors you're in. I do a lot of work these days on issues around workforce and workforce, really. And that is a place where women, you see a lot more women in different kinds of roles. So it's been a very different set of experiences across those professions.
There's also a very strong movement toward diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ESG, or environmental, social, and governance practices. And I've been involved working with a lot of corporations helping develop these areas, and now the SEC is coming in and regulating it, which will hopefully incentivize more companies to be really addressing the barriers that women encounter in workplaces. The key here is really being authentic, because consumers, investors, employees want to work with companies who are pursuing diversity and inclusion. Susanna, in your view, how can we catalyze or accelerate gender equity change? Can you talk about the status of DEI metrics?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's it's easier to focus on diversity because as long as people are self-identifying and reporting the groups that they identify with, organizations can have that data. Measuring equity is far more complicated unless you're talking about pay equity, and inclusion is where there is the loosest and least amount of clarity. So for example, our firm is doing groundbreaking work using network science to define new ways of describing and measuring inclusion and putting more specificity and rigor around it, because when you look at the social science and the IO psychological research on it, there really is no consensus around what do we mean by inclusion. So it's sort of every organization for itself at this point. The bottom line is what gets measured gets done, that old adage. And so we need to bring far more rigor and far more science, which with the artificial intelligence and advanced analytics and data science, we're able to do now. So I think that focus on quantitative, objective analysis is really where we need to be focused.
Thanks, Susanna. In addition to increasing the number of women in leadership roles, a lot has been written about the importance of diversity in the boardroom. So Beth, what do we need to do to increase gender parity in leadership positions specific to the corporate boardroom? I know you have experience on the CBRE board as a trustee of Princeton, board member of the United Way. What is the experience like, and are there different attitudes towards men versus women?
So I've been fortunate to serve on a set of boards where diversity is a major commitment. And I think what you need to do is actually make it a commitment and then commit to finding the talent that goes with it. The board of CBRE has 3 women, including a fellow Princetonian, Shira Goodman. Shira Goodman is on the board. She was the former CEO of Staples, right? She brings an enormous wealth of corporate experience. The other woman on the board is Laura Tyson, who was the head of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton and the dean of the Haas School of Business. Those are people who should be on any board. And by the way, it's a board that also of its 12 members have 4 non-white men. So actually quite a diverse board, but really mostly it's a talented board. And so to me, you have to just think more broadly about talent. If you say the only way you can put people on boards is if they're a former CEO, you're never going to have any women. You're never going to have any people of color because there aren't those people who've been in the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. But there are enormous amounts of talent if you look for it. By the way, given that we're here at the Princeton Club of New York, I will just note that the Princeton Board of Trustees is basically 50-50 women and men, including its current chair, Weezy Sams, and the prior chair, Katie Hall, another member of the great class of 1980. And so, you know, that's an incredibly rich set of experiences, but again, an immensely talented set of individuals.
Thank you for that perspective, Beth. There's been a lot written about the gender divide in terms of taking on new roles and also negotiating for the best terms when you get a new job. A Harvard Business School report noted that men apply for a job when they only meet 60% of the qualifications, but women apply only if they meet 100% of them. And studies also show that by neglecting to negotiate a woman's starting salary for her first job, she may sacrifice over $500,000 by the end of her career. That's pretty dramatic. Ellen, what are your thoughts about this?
So I see this all the time. When I was head of the architecture department at Georgia Tech, I would just see that I would be lowballing the women just like I'm lowballing the men on my salary offers. And yet the men consistently would counteroffer, and not a huge amount, but just, you know, they're expecting that we would be negotiating. Whereas these brilliant women that I'm hiring for faculty positions, none of them counteroffered, ever. And I would have to try to catch up, like, damn it, now you've put me out of balance. I wanted you more. And I would let them know eventually about that. And so now I have, you know, I've been teaching for 35 years. I have lots of students, and I tell them, of course, I'm willing to be a reference for you for the rest of your life. That's part of what we as faculty do. I said, but, and especially for the women students, I said, you have to promise me you are going to rehearse how to make a counter offer for every single job you go after. And I've had, oh, no, I can't possibly do that. I just, you know, I'm like, all right, we're going to rehearse it. Here's the language. How much would you ask for? I mean, it just, and then I get back these incredible stories of where they'll tell me, it worked, you know, they respect me and they're paying me more. But it's just one of the things that I think we just really need to help. You know, I also advise the women who are going into male-dominated professions that nowadays schools are, because there's so much of a more interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion, a lot of firms are looking for women, but to be careful, my radar is always up pretty high for what I call the peeing sitting down jobs. You know, are they mostly interested in you because, oh, you pee sitting down? Oh, please come join us. In which case, you're going to be fired. You know, you're going to be fired for the same reason. That's really why they hired you. So I just really try to make it very clear to the students, kind of as they're entering the professions, to believe in themselves and really value. We don't teach our girls to own their accomplishments and brag the same way we teach our boys. And that is still, I think, so fundamental at weakening our ability to really negotiate. And that's part of why our salaries are where they are.
Thanks, Ellen. So let's look forward a bit at this point. At the beginning of 2020, the representation of women in corporate America was trending in the right direction upward. Everyone has been impacted greatly by the pandemic, but evidence suggests that women have taken the biggest hit. So their job losses have pushed the women's labor force down to a 33-year low. And even more concerning, more than 1 in 4 women are now contemplating what many would have thought unthinkable, downshifting their careers or leaving the workforce completely, which is really an emergency for corporate America that could unravel years of painstaking progress. So Beth, I know you're working with Markle and Skillful. How much has the pandemic set gender equality back, and what can be done to continue to move the trajectory forward?
The pandemic has had significant impacts on all sorts of equity issues, Wendy, as you described. Gender equity, the economic pain from the recession is so disproportionately felt by low-wage workers, workers with less formal education. Unemployment rates for Black and Latinx are vastly higher than for whites. It has been a very, very uneven demand. And I think without explicit focus on these issues, we are going to have a recovery that will make things more unequal than they were before. And they were already too unequal to start with. So I think in the policy response to the proposal and in corporate actions around this, I think you have to go into it with this in mind and say, what are we going to do to address those issues? When you think about things like investing in training, you've got to think about, the 2/3 of the American workforce that does not have a college degree. How do you make sure that individuals not just have access to training, but to the family support they need to be able to pursue that training? How do you make sure that some of those high growth jobs that have traditionally not had high representation of women are working to bring people in? How do you get employers, what we spend a lot of time on, recognizing that people can have built skills in lots of different ways and that they're very transferable skills from some of those occupations that might have more representation of women to the growth jobs of tomorrow. So it's got to take a conscious effort, because the natural sort of just letting things recover the way they are is going to make outcomes more unequal than they were going in, and they were already unequal to start with.
Thank you, Beth. That's really a great conclusion, that it's going to take effort on behalf of companies and all of us to really drive this forward. And now we're going to close our part of the talk, our comments, with a lightning round before we take audience questions. For the audience, please remember to add your questions into the Q&A. So everybody, all my esteemed classmates, what advice do we have for today's young women and young men? And since it's a lightning round, let's try to limit our advice to a sentence or two. For me, it's be persistent, be resilient, think big about your goals, and work hard to make them happen. Tina, how about you?
I would second that, but also know what you want when you walk into a room. If you understand who it is you're meeting with, what they can give you, and how they can elevate you, and know exactly what to ask them, because you can blow a big opportunity by asking for the wrong thing.
Great. And Donna, how about you?
Well, if you're lucky enough to find your passion, follow your passion. I think you do really your best work when you love it. And then believe in yourself, be brave, and be bold.
Thank you. Beth, how about you?
I'll build on Tina's. Assume you can and ask to do that. And if you can't, well, you're just back where you started. So go for what you can.
Susanna.
Know that you're not crazy. It's not you. It's the system. If you're feeling wobbly, it's the system. It's not you.
Okay, and Ellen.
My advice is don't limit yourself to role models that look like you. On the one hand, it's obviously really helpful at so many different ages, especially when we're really young, to look for role models that look like us, but don't limit yourself. I think there's all sorts of role models that all of us can learn from.
Okay, and thank you all. And now we'll take questions from the audience. So please remember to click on the Q&A tab and write your questions into the box. So I'm going to take the first question, and Ellen and Susanna, thank you for taking a look at them as well. So for the panel, I wonder if you could reflect on public or corporate policy changes that are needed to advance gender equity. I'll start here by saying that in addition to raising the number of women involved in leadership roles, we have to build inclusivity, because just raising the numbers without really driving an authentic effort to be inclusive will not accomplish the end goal. Women need to be an important part of the culture, listened to, in order to really drive corporate growth. Who else would like to take that one on? Public or corporate policy changes?
So I think there's,
Yeah.
I think there's maybe Suzanne might say the same thing, but there's enormous value in actually making data visible. What is happening to women, not just the beginning of their career, but the middle, the end, the high levels of the career? Where are those drop-offs following? How do you make that data visible? Because there's nothing like, nobody wants to be at the bottom of that list, and people want to be at the top. So I think using the availability of data and its visibility to try and induce positive change.
Terrific. Okay, we have a question which I anticipated might come in. We're going to touch on it. It's a comment on sexual harassment, colleagues, clients. So I will say that I'm sure many of us encountered some type of harassment. In our day, it was really something that you didn't necessarily raise visibility out. You kind of laughed it off or just ignored it. And I'm very grateful that the women of today are really taking a much sharper stand on it and really trying to change the situation on this. Anybody else want to weigh in on this?
Well, I believe that, especially in the entertainment business, which was really in the profile and in the nation in regards to Harvey Weinstein, who was the biggest, but people have been taking advantage of women and their vulnerability or assumed vulnerability for decades in this business. And personally, I had two situations in my life where at the beginning when I was thinking I wanted to pursue the arts, and I went on an audition and was asked to, disrobe, and I was so frightened and didn't know what to do and ended up leaving the room. And another one, I was an executive at Disney when a famous associate of a very famous artist, casually said there was some paperwork in their room at like the Beverly Hills Hotel, and could I accompany them there? And tried to make an advance, and it was and in those situations back then, I was glad that I was who I was and could stand up and say I'm sorry and just walk away, and never talked about it, never said it to anything about it. And it wasn't the kind of thing you would, because the person with whom they were associated was a big star and it didn't have any reason to do so. But those things happen, and I think that what has happened now in our universe is that people aren't afraid to step up anymore. At least they shouldn't be. I mean, I'm sure there's still possibility where somebody that you respect and your job is dependent on what are you going to do. But I think that the environment is such where you will be believed. And so the point is to always step up and not believe that if you step up and something happens, that's the end of the world. As a talent manager, my partner and I have laughed. Sometimes we've had clients who are, leave for whatever reason, and you know what? You get a little heartbroken, but God brings someone a little better the next day. So there's never any opportunity that you're going to lose that's worth losing your self-respect for. Something better will come.
Here's another question that I think is particularly appropriate for you, Ellen. One of the gentlemen in our audience, thank you very much for joining and sharing your question, asked, how do you recommend working women today approach the subject of maternity leave policies when interviewing for a new opportunity? It's a question that is often not asked due to fear of gender bias. How does a woman make the best choice for her career and her family?
I would actually start the question by asking, what are your policies on maternity and paternity leave? Because it's if any organization doesn't have both, you probably don't want to work there. And I think I really do think, it was funny at one point when I was teaching at MIT, one of my colleagues, he's a great architect. His wife is an architect. They had 2 kids, and he was chastised because at one point he couldn't make it to the faculty meeting because one of the kids was sick, and he was running off to go help his sick kid. And afterwards, literally, the school chair pulled him aside and was saying, your wife should be doing that. You are a professor at MIT. You need to be here. and really, my friend responded, we share. But it was not it was just so outside the norm of what the kind of older guard could imagine. So I really think I would certainly recommend that if you put the question, so it's not necessarily seen as, just about me, but actually in general, you're asking about maternity and paternity leave. That's what I would recommend.
That's great advice. And we have another one that's somewhat similar, but a little bit later, which is that this person would like to start a family, but not sure whether he or she would like to continue to push to advance their career concurrently or potentially take a step back. How did you make this decision for yourselves? And if you decided to go part-time or step back, did you decide to do so even before you started a family or realized that you wanted to after having children? So I'll kick this off. I had really planned to continue working full-time forever after having kids. And I really felt I had my first child while I was working with Ralph Lauren and continued to work really long hours. Felt perpetually torn about, I was still the primary caregiver, despite the fact that I had a very high-powered job. So I was perpetually torn in two directions. And I did it for a year and ultimately decided to start a consulting firm in order to have the flexibility. Looking back, if there had been an opportunity for part-time, that's what I would suggest doing. So it wasn't there for me, but this way you keep your toe in the water and can continue to grow in your career while also being available for your family. Anybody else want to weigh in on this one?
So I'll just weigh in, which is, this is one of those decisions that, many of us like to plan our lives, and we all have all these things. And the one piece I'd say is you can plan all you want, but you don't know. You don't know if you're going to have a kid who's going to sleep through the night early, or whether you've got a kid who's never sleeps, and so how can you function in the morning? You don't know if your kid's going to be healthy or have special needs. There's a whole set of things that you can't plan. And so there isn't a right answer for everyone. There's the right answer for you and your family and your context. And that could be stepping back fully. That could be working part-time. That could be keeping going, because that's what makes you happy. And so I do think one often overthinks it. And by the way, it changes, right? So it changes as your child changes at different points in their lives. So at some level, I'd say don't overthink it, because you won't really know. And you should expect that whatever you decide over the course of a child's long lifetime, it will change. You will not have the same answer forever, at least probably not.
Ellen.
I'd like to jump in on this, even though, my husband and I chose not to have children. So I can't speak from that side, but if I put my designer, architect, urbanist hat on, I think one of the most important, we have designed the world. Every single suburban subdivision is designed for a stay-at-home mom, a model that is 70 years old, and we are still reproducing it. We still design most of our downtowns, our buildings. We had more places and convenient childcare, more co-op kitchens. We had more facilities to reduce the double shift and the burden on women with Rosie the Riveter. When the men were all at war, we figured out how to actually build neighbor places with much more gender parity. And to enable more women to not have to feel like this choice has to be this complete either or, we need to really be advocating for a lot more childcare, senior care integrated into our lives.
And along those same lines, I think the other thing is, for women who are deep into their careers, who can't afford to take a sidestep or step out, those of us who are in the workplaces need to use our voices to really advocate for the fact that these are human issues. Back to Ellen's point, it's not maternity or paternity. These are human issues, and we need to make our workplaces much more humane when it comes to just the realities of life. And the fact that children get sick and parents become older and need assistance, and all sorts of issues. And back to Ellen's point, not believe that we're still in the Don Draper era of professional environments, and that somehow magically everything stays perfect while this glossy professional workplace carries on. Life is messy, and let's get real about it, and be exceptional at what we love to do, both at work and at home.
Yes, and the other thing, sorry, go on, Tina.
I was just going to say, I think also just that it's important to kind of look at ourselves as global citizens and see the ways in which other countries handle this issue. And it's one of those things where you go to Germany and you see that, women get 2 years off and their job has to be held, and men get a year off. And, these kinds of things that happen in other countries. I mean, America has been leaders in so many things, and this is one area where I think that we could grow from, and people who are in policy situations could, help by, putting some laws into place that at least address this, or at least on a corporate level, when they are in high positions, to be able to enter this and have it not be a women's issue. Again, it needs to be bipartisan. It needs to be both men and women, because they're both parents, and children are important. And it is seen that through the pandemic that more women than men have had to leave the workforce because of these issues in terms of taking care of children and homeschooling and everything else. So I think that it is something that even now, especially going back into a new paradigm, depending upon whether or not people go back and choose to work at home versus going back in the office, but figuring out ways to handle these issues. I know for me, I never knew when I was a Princeton student that I would face what I did when my mother took ill. I never was prepared for it mentally. No one ever talked about it. But I faced it, and you end up handling it when you're faced against the wall. But you do need help from family and friends. It takes a village, and you need lawmakers and people on the corporate and boardroom level aware of it and wanting to change it. But hopefully they're all human and they all have these same issues too. So hopefully there is a awareness and ability to make change.
Looking at best practices is really critical. I also wanted to add, there's no good time. If you're thinking about starting a family and trying to plan it out, there will never be the right time. At a certain point, you just have to go for it. And the other piece I think that's very important to say on this panel is, for those who take a step off the career path and decide to stay at home, that is a lot of work. There's a lot of benefits to doing that. Raising children is a very, very wonderful thing to really build the future forward. So not to be judgmental on any account, everything that women are doing, whether in the home, whether in schools, whether in work, is something to be valued and praised, and no decision is any less than the other. The one thing is, no matter what you're doing, you're constantly balancing, because women have so many things on their plate and they continue to try to do it all. I did see one person, Brooke, had sent a note that she is involved with a girls' school, and she thinks some of the students there would benefit from this conversation, and could we share a recording? So absolutely, we are recording tonight's talk. As a participant, you'll be getting a copy of the recording, and please do feel free to share the talk with anybody that you think might benefit. Ellen, Susanna, do you want to pick a couple of questions?
Sure. I'll let Susanna, do you want to go first? Or else I've got one.
Go ahead, Ellen, and I'll follow later.
Okay. So there's a question. Are there any books in particular that you each found of great influence upon you in terms of finding balance between personal life and career. Any authors in general, whether nonfiction or fiction, that helped you along the way? So I'll start by saying Virginia Valin, V-A-L-I-A-N, is a sociologist who I saw give a lecture at MIT in an audience of probably, I think it was about an 800-seat auditorium. And while she was talking, she'd just written a book called Why So Slow? And I was blushing, like, how can she be talking about me in front of all these people? Because she argued, she really had done a ton of studies on why so slow, mostly on pay equity amongst women and the lack of negotiating. But also, she said that women, when we succeed, I think it was 75% of the time, we just say, oh, I was so lucky. Or we say, I worked so hard. We don't know how to own our accomplishments. And I think so she's got a great book. There's on the architecture and design, Redesigning the American Dream by Dolores Hayden is amazing. Vienna, for 35 years, the city of Vienna has had gender mainstreaming as a position in their planning department. And they are designing entire neighborhoods now and transit systems and parks that are really doing some pretty awesome stuff.
That's incredible. This is another great book, Women Don't Ask, by Linda Babcock and Sarah Lashiver, about negotiation and the gender divide.
I've got one here called The Fix by Michelle P. King. This came out, I think, last year, and Michelle King is a journalist and gender equity advocate. The subtitle is Overcome the Invisible Barriers That Are Holding Women Back at Work. And we really haven't talked much about those invisible barriers. We've talked a lot about the explicit stuff that goes on. And yet, implicit bias is something that's there. We all have it. You can't avoid it and eliminate it. You can't ever eliminate it. But we have institutionalized processes and policies that sort of calcify implicit bias, and The Fix is about unwinding and undoing those things, along with What Works for Women at Work by Joan Dempsey and I always get their names, some other daughter, Joan Williams, and Rachel Dempsey is her daughter, which is a series of it's an anecdotal research body of research where they looked at 4 kind of meta patterns that are also some of the hurdles women have to overcome. So those are the 2 books that really changed my thinking and my view of the world of women and work.
Susanna, do you want to pick one last question?
One last question. I love, if this came from one of our classmates, in full disclosure, and his question is, where can I find it? What is the most important, meaningful thing that men can do to support gender equity in the workplace?
So I'll start with that one, and a great question, so thank you. I think I'll go back to my comment earlier about what it means about sponsorship. And this is really about sort of fostering inclusion. How are you doing a bunch of things? It is actually thinking about how you create opportunities for individuals to shine and make sure they succeed. That is an incredibly important thing, to be their advocate on their behalf. And then the other part is, when stuff happens and there are less of some of the remarks than before, but there's still plenty of things. You've got to be the person who's there to call it out, because that it is hard for the individual, particularly if they're junior and in the minority, to stand up for themselves. So it is on all of us to stand up for them and to really create an opportunity for people's talents to shine through.
Okay, I think that was really well said. And I just I very much want to thank you for all the wonderful questions. I wish we had gotten to more. And thank you, Beth, Ellen, Donna, Susanna, and Tina for joining us to share your wonderful stories and insights about women and the glass ceiling. And a special thank you to Donna for coming up with the idea for this discussion. I also want to thank the Princeton Club of New York, the sponsor of tonight's program, as well as our co-sponsors, Princeton Association of New York, Princeton Arts Alumni, Princeton Club of Georgia, Princeton Club of Southern California, and Princeton in Hollywood. It's nice to have such a broad geographical representation for this important topic. And thank you to all of us who joined us this evening. As I mentioned, the Princeton Club is recording the talk, and we'll be sending everyone the link. And I think it probably makes sense to all of us. Why don't we share some of the books we love in our follow-up email so everybody has that? So we hope tonight inspires all of you, women
Wendy,
and
I'm
men.
sorry, I'd like
Yes.
to interrupt.
Yes.
I want to thank you, Wendy, for all the work that you put in, not just for this Tiger Talk, but for everything. It really has been a highlight of my pandemic season, and I look forward to so many more, but bravo to you for doing such superb work.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. And so we really hope tonight inspires all of you, men and women, to advocate and take action to build a more diverse, inclusive, and flexible workspace, to create sponsorship, as Beth noted, so we can nurture a culture in which women have an equal opportunity to achieve their potential and to succeed. We need to incentivize corporate leaders to recognize the strengths that women bring to the table, and that a more inclusive workplace is not only necessary, but also profitable. And I hope you'll join us for some other programs we've got coming up. I'll be hosting a series of talks on sustainability and ESG in April. And as I mentioned, Emmy-nominated producer Cecilia Peck will join us on April 7th at 8 p.m. Tonight, we're going to close with a special musical piece, thanks to Donna. It's a stunning new rendition of composer Ethel Smith's rousing anthem of the suffrage movement, and it's called The March of the Women. It features a star-studded ensemble of female classical musicians, including tonight's panelist, Donna Wang-Friedman. So thank you all again for joining us this evening, and our panel, thank you for your insightful and remarkable comments and insights.
Hi, I'm New York Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul. 100 years ago today, our nation finally extended to women the most fundamental right in our democracy, the right to vote. New York is proud to be the birthplace of the women's rights movement, and we're proud to be celebrating the anniversary this year. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce this musical tribute. It is a new arrangement of Ethel Smith's anthem of the suffrage movement, The March of the Women. It features an ensemble of some of today's most celebrated women, classical musicians, many of whom are New York-based. And it's presented by a New York-based series, Performances with Allison Charney, Season of Hope, in conjunction with Her Music, Her Story. Although there's still more work to be done, it is critical that we take time to celebrate this historic achievement, standing shoulder to shoulder and friend to friend, as the song urges us to do. Thank you and enjoy.
Shout, shout, on with the song, cry with the wing, for the dawn is breaking. March, march, sing you along, wide goes our banner and hope is waking. Song with its story, dreams with their glory, lo they call, and glad is their word. Loud and louder it swells, thunder of freedom, the voice of the Lord. today preparing, firm in reliance, laugh and defy.